to understand excuse. So first of all, understand a maxim related to this, that anything that is unusually difficult to avoid is excused with three conditions. One, that it not be deliberate. Two, that it not be from dog or pig. And three, that it not change the thing. And typically when we talk about change, we're talking about a liquid being changed by filth. And there's exceptions to each of these. So even in some exceptional cases, things that break those conditions are excused. So an example of an exception for it being deliberate is when you put meat in a pot of water to cook it, and the blood goes into the water. That's deliberate, and it's excused. Right? If you're going to make stew and you put the water in the meat in the pot in the water, and you have bloody water, then that's najis. It's excused. That's an example when it's that's an example that's an exception for it being deliberate, and it's also an example that's an exception of when it changes, because it changes the water. And then as for an example of an exception when it's from dog or pig, if it's such a small quantity that you can't perceive it with normal eyesight when it occurs. So filth that's such a small quantity that you can't perceive it with normal eyesight is excused, whether it's from dog or pig or anything else. And we're going to mention that. We're going to mention that as well. But with those three conditions, anything that's unusually difficult to avoid is excused. And we'll mention a number of examples of this. Okay, he mentioned these two scenarios in which filth is excused. We're going to mention one more, which is one of the most fundamental ones that they always mention. And that is a quantity of filth that is so small that you don't perceive it with normal eyesight when it occurs. So what's an example of that? An example of that would be, for instance, if like a dog got wet and then shook itself off, and you felt the coolness of a drop on your hand, and then you looked at your hand and you couldn't see it. You know that a tiny microscopic drop, you felt it on your hand, so you know it's there, you're certain. However, when you look at it, you can't see it. Or some other filth as well. That's excused. It's such a small quantity that you can't perceive it with normal eyesight, and it's excused. And other examples occur of that as well. So that's one of the exceptions, and that commonly occurs. That it's such a small amount that you can't perceive it with normal sight, that's excused. Another example when filth is excused is a path or a space that you have to walk on that you know is impure and it's difficult to avoid, is excused typically. So examples that they make, for instance, are like a mosque that they mentioned, and this was a specific fatwa in somewhere in the Muslim land that was on the coast, and there was a place where the spray from the ocean would come up onto the walkway up to this mosque, and dogs would hang out there. So you see the dogs hanging out on the wet path, but that's the only pathway to the mosque, and you have to walk down that pathway. Then walking over that pathway is excused. And similarly, an example they mention is like historically, and actually not even historically, even currently, in places where they still use, there's still a lot of livestock, and their dung is in the street. So the mud of the street becomes mixed with their dung, and you know it's impure. If you have to pass down that street and walk over filthy earth, that's excused, provided that you don't actually see the substance of the filth on your clothing or your feet, and it's not an unusually large amount that's got on your clothing, and it was difficult to avoid. So if someone walks through mud, essentially, that they have to walk on a pathway that they have to go down, like to their door, or to the mosque, and so forth, and it's difficult to avoid, and they have to walk over this filthy earth in the street, again, provided that it's difficult to avoid and it's not an exceptionally large amount, like they didn't fall down in it or something, but it's just what you would get on your feet and the bottom of your clothes, perhaps walking in normal circumstances, and also that the actual substance of the filth, they don't see droppings of, for instance, goats on their clothing, but it's just mud that they know is mixed with that, then that's excused. Another example of an exception is a child who's still nursing and it vomits, so then its mouth is now filthy, but it has to nurse from its mother. So then do we say that her body is impure and she has to wash it in order to pray? No, it's excused, again, because that's something that's difficult to avoid. Similarly, the drool of that child. If the child, and you saw the child spits up, we know that then its mouth is mutanajjis. It's not going to be very easy to purify the mouth of a really small baby that doesn't drink water yet, so it remains impure. However, its drool, or when it nurses from its mother, or if you kiss it or what have you, that's excused because, again, that's something that's exception. It's unusually difficult to avoid that. La ilaha illallah. Other examples that are important. So those are a few examples. And then, as a general rule of thumb, anything that's unusually difficult to avoid is excused with those conditions. So, like if you find yourself in a situation that just seems impossible to function, the likelihood with respect to najasa is that situation is going to be excused. Then there's another fundamental that should be understood with respect to things that are affected by filth, and that is, as we will see in a moment, the initial assumption of objects is their purity. We're going to see that in a moment. We're going to discuss that. And then anything that is initially ruled pure, its basic ruling, the initial assumption concerning it is purity, though it's commonly affected by filth. Unless one is absolutely sure, it returns to its initial assumption. Right? So something that is initially ruled pure and commonly affected by filth, unless you're certain that this particular thing is affected by filth, it returns to the initial assumption, and that is that we rule it as pure. Though if that's typically the case, it's makruh to use it, for instance, for consumption or to wear it for prayer, but the ruling of it is still that it's pure. So what are examples of that? The clothing of a baby, right? Baby clothing that has been worn for a period of time is typically has some spit up or has a diaper that's leaked or whatever, right? That's typically impure, but say a baby came and sits on your lap while you're praying and you don't know the condition of that baby's diaper, the condition of the baby's clothing, then we return to the initial assumption, which is the purity of those objects that the clothing is comprised of. Cotton or buttons or zippers or whatever. All of that's initially assumed pure. Typically it's impure. We don't know, so we go back to the initial assumption. Another example is the dishes of people who eat pork. Right? The dishes of people who eat pork. Say someone eats pork and you know they eat pork and they have a dishwasher. Typically, those dishes of all would have been affected by that and put in the same dishwasher and blah, 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 right? Typically, or a restaurant. However, the initial assumption of porcelain or ceramics and metal and plastic and so forth that these dishes are made from, the initial ruling of those is their purity. The likelihood is, and what's typically the case, is they're impure. So in the absence of certainty, meaning I didn't see a pork chop on this specific plate, and then I kept watching it and it never went away, and so I know that this is now impure. In the absence of certainty, we go back again to the initial assumption. So that's something that's also needed, because otherwise, again, you can construct a mutanajjis world for yourself, an impure world for yourself. So someone says, well, most soaps have lard, and then when you go to a hotel, people use most soaps, so now I can't take a shower in the hotel because it wasn't ever washed with earth. Forget about it, because the ruling of that tub or shower, whatever, initially was pure, and there's not absolute certainty about its impurity, so then it returns to that initial assumption of purity. Though again, if that's the likelihood, it's offensive, but we're in a lot of circumstances where one just simply has to fall back on that ruling, and Allah knows best. So those are some rulings related to filth when it is excused in order to La ilaha illallah, give us some ease, and alhamdulillah wa shukrulillah ala dhalik. La ilaha illallah. So we said that we would return to that categorization. So with respect to filth that is excused, you have filth that is excused in water and not in prayer. An example of that is like the carcass of an animal that doesn't have flowing blood, like insects. If it falls in water with the conditions that were mentioned earlier, it doesn't render the water impure, but it's not excused in prayer, so you can't carry it in prayer. We have filth that is excused in prayer, not in water. An example is blood and pus. We have filth that's excused in neither. An example is like urine. And we have a filth that's excused in both. An example is something so small when it occurs that you can't perceive it with normal eyesight. And there's a whole lot more detail to this question. We're just mentioning some of the common examples and going into a little more detail so that people have some ease. But actually, when they discuss the questions concerning filth, most of the discussion is about the types that are excused, and little of the discussion is about actually those types that are unexcused, because that's necessary to live and function properly, and Allah knows best. You had a question?
If your clothing is too long and you're walking on an area that really possibly is not impure, would that be an avoidable circumstance where you should have listed it? Or?
Not for a lady.